Welcome back to In Focus, everyone. Wednesday marked a huge victory, it appears, for farmers in the Netherlands after the farmer citizen movement won big in the Dutch provincial elections, which makes up their Senate. According to exit polls this morning, the Farmers Group is set to win 15 out of 75 seats, which will make them the biggest party in the Parliament's high chamber, which came as a shock to Dutch politicians. The Farmers Citizen Movement didn't even exist until 2019. It was set up in the wake of the widespread farmers' protests against tyrannical government policies. This is what happens when the government goes after hardworking citizens, the backbone of their country. Let's bring on Louis Brackbull to discuss this. He's a journalist and reporter for Iconic Media, has spent quite a bit of time in the Netherlands throughout these protests. Louis, good to see you. I don't know too much about Dutch politics or what's going on over there. Fill us in.
Yeah, I'm just starting to get to grips with it as well. So let's give it a shot. So this win is a massive shock, to say the least, to, of course, the big Marc Rutte's government, who is looking to, of course, cut nitrogen emissions over there. There is a few things that we need to, of course, be made aware of in terms of this. Now, I believe that an estimated 61% of people turned out to vote in this provincial election, which I think is great, because you've seen over the last 3 years that this movement, this Dutch farmer protest movement, has really grown rapidly. And of course, being on the ground in the Netherlands, covering the protests consistently and speaking to everyday farmers to ask them, how do they feel? They felt hopeless. They felt like nothing can be done. But now we've seen this particular party, the acronym being BBB, which is a farmer citizens movement, has grown now to have, like you mentioned, 15 seats in the Senate, which to me sounds fantastic. Now, there's a couple of things to, of course, look into when it comes to this particular political party. We need to acknowledge that Labour left and the Greens still have some form of say and power here, because, of course, their votes, of course, counted, and they are still, of course, part of this Senate race. And it can either be a choice now between a coalition between the left or the right, quote unquote. Now, the thing that we've seen with this particular party, the only gripe that we can see is that they acknowledge that nitrogen is, of course, this poisonous, horrible thing that we need to not necessarily cut out, but they acknowledge that it's still poisonous and harmful, considering that the Netherlands is the second largest exporter of food. And, of course, farmers need nitrogen, or stikstof, as they call it over there. So acknowledging that it's still poisonous and very, very, very harmful, and that it still needs to be cut, is quite alarming. However, the people of the Netherlands and farmers and people that have voted for this party still need to keep up the pressure in making sure that they can have their say in the Senate and make sure that 2,000 to 3,000 farms aren't going to be bought out by Marc Rutte, and to reverse these policies, these horrible, draconian policies that are going to see everyday farmers, of course, phased out. Because remember, it's not just an occupation for these farmers; it's their life. They've been there for decades. So it's something that ordinary voters, people, need to be made aware of. They need to make sure that, of course, they're applying pressure to this influence, to this party. So yeah, it's just about making sure that this party can fulfill its duty by siding with the farmers completely.
Now, you mentioned that you have the Greens saying, oh, nitrogen, it's bad for the earth, it's bad for the climate. You know what else is bad? Starving to death. So when you have Dutch farmers who are one of the largest exporters, the Netherlands' largest exporter, one of food, I'm going to listen to the people who are going to prevent me from starving to death as to what they need to make that happen, to put food on the table, Lewis. So where does the government get off saying, you can't use this. This is bad for it's gonna anger the sun monster or something like that. Okay, well, according to them, the choices are anger the sun monster or everyone die of starvation. Pick your poison.
Exactly. And remember, this isn't to do with climate change. This isn't to do with a climate catastrophe. It's about control. We all know this. Like you mentioned, and like I've mentioned, it's the second largest exporter of food just under the United States. That is a massive responsibility for not only Europe, but the rest of the world as well. It is an extremely important asset, the Netherlands. And it is so important that we have these conversations and that news broadcasters are, of course, talking openly and frankly that people need to protect this agricultural sector in Europe because it's so important. It must not fall to the hands of these extreme globalists who want to, of course, exploit that for their own particular control. It's so important that we acknowledge that and that we try and apply more pressure to this new party that has come from nowhere to somewhere. Yeah. And being on the ground last year and of course talking to people now this year, I'm so happy, as well as speaking to yourself, because that's how I met you, Addison, is by coming on your show last year when I was on the ground there. It's so important for news broadcasters like yourself and, of course, many other people to actually shine a light on this issue, because a lot of people felt like there was no hope, and now people feel that there is hope, but people must remain vigilant to this result. So all my advice would be to people is just stay vigilant. If something doesn't seem right, you keep up the pressure. And that's all I've got to say about that.
It's just a phenomenal story of how quickly they were able to turn things around. It would appear, we certainly hope this continues to trend in the right direction. Lewis Brackpool from Iconic Media, thank you so much for coming on. Great to see you again.
Thank you, Addison. It's always a pleasure.
And in case you missed it, President Biden brought his climate change fear-mongering to a DNC dinner in Vegas this week, in which he warned everyone in attendance that the climate change could cause the Colorado River to dry up completely. According to reports, the president told the crowd, quote, "You're not going to be able to drink out of the Colorado River soon." Going on to say, if we don't keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we're going to damn our children to circumstances where we are the only truly existential threat of nuclear war. We are only truly the existential... Not exactly sure what he meant by that. Anyways, he said something similar to this during his interview with Comedy Central last week. Listen.
Floods, droughts, all the things. And so people can't deny it anymore. If we don't keep the temperature from going above 1.5 degrees Celsius raised, then we're in real trouble. That whole generation is damned. I mean, that's not hyperbole. Really, truly trouble.
I want to bring on Marc Morano to discuss this, founder of the Climate Depot. Marc, are these claims true that we're not going to be able to drink out of the Colorado River the way things are trending?
Well, first of all, on that point, let's start with the Colorado River. There's a peer-reviewed study from 2017 about the history of droughts on the Colorado River. The most severe droughts in its history were in previous centuries, 1904, the 1930s, and then they even go back, I think it's 1800 years, and show you that nothing that's happened in the past is even close to what's happening now, meaning there was much, much worse in the past. And interestingly, global droughts, even the United Nations will admit this in the fine print. There is no trend in the storminess of hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, and droughts. And the other thing he said was wildfires. If you look at the United States and look at wildfires, there's been about an 80–90% reduction since the 1920s in wildfires. Wildfires are not increasing on climate timescales. Beyond that, I will say this. Wildfires are not even a good measure to look at climate change because they deal with government forestry policies and water, land use, development. All sorts of political and bureaucratic decisions come into play on what causes wildfires. So I think that whole thing was ridiculous. And the most disturbing thing, Addison, he said, was about the kids. They were a generation damned. This is something the New York Times and many other climate activists, they've invoked this sort of religious imagery. We have, I think it was Tom Friedman, New York Times, about 8 years ago, said that if you deny global warming, it's an almost inconceivable sin. So he's using these young people as an excuse to pass policies that have nothing to do with the Climate. Inflation Reduction Act, by the way, will not even impact global CO2 levels, let alone anything he was potentially talking about.
Yeah, if you don't get on your knees and bow before the climate change gods, the sun monster is going to kill you. We've been hearing that for decades and decades, and it has always ended up not to be true. In fact, humanity is better off than we were back when they were saying the world was going to end. We're better off. World hunger's at record lows. We're only improving, Mark. So how do they keep getting away with saying you're all going to die? I think of people like Paul Ehrlich, who was saying that we were going to go extinct like 20-something years ago.
Yeah, in fact, I will say this. Here's the good news, Addison. Global climate doomsday predictions are disappearing, but they're only disappearing from the tweets from Greta Thunberg. She was caught deleting a 2018 tweet warning that the Earth could be done in 5 years if we didn't act immediately. Guess what? Deadline passed. She thought she could get away with deleting it. She couldn't. And so here's the other thing Biden, and to answer your question just even more fully, when current reality fails to alarm, make scarier and scarier predictions of the future. And that's what they're doing. Biden referenced this 1.5 degree temperature goal that we have to meet. In the ClimateGate emails, we know that temperature goal was, quote, pulled from thin air, according to top UN scientists, that it has no atmospheric or temperature measurement whatsoever. It's a political number that people are using to justify draconian climate policy, which won't even impact global CO2 levels, by the way, because China and India, the developing world, aren't going to play along. So it's the West crushing ourselves. And the one final thought here is it's amazing how the climate mob, if you will, is so upset every time the United States wants to do any fossil fuel project. The Earth is over, it's carbon bomb, it's the end of the... But China, OPEC, the Middle East, Venezuela, Russia, they can do whatever they want. You'll never hear the same climate establishment make any protests. In fact, we'll beg them for their energy instead of producing it here, because apparently providing good human rights records and best environmental standards in the world is horrible for the planet.
Well, not only can China and them do the same thing, they can do it worse. They can be more environmentally irresponsible, and the people who claim to care about the environment not going to say a peep. Marc Morano from the Climate Depot, great to see you. Thank you for being here again.
Thank you, Addison. Appreciate it.